Today, the people of Illinois can be proud that we're putting state government back on the side of working families. They can be proud that we're restoring fiscal responsibility after many years of crisis and deficits. We started this session with an ambitious agenda, and there were skeptics. They said it couldn't be done. They said that Springfield doesn't move that quickly. Our challenges are too large, and our government is too dysfunctional, they said. But what the skeptics failed to realize is that no obstacle can dwarf the transformative power of a state government and legislature that stands up for working families. And with that as our guiding principle, together, we just accomplished one of the most ambitious and consequential legislative sessions in this state's history. Illinois is back, Illinois is open for business, that this is a place that stands up for working families, that we've got a great future ahead of us. That's what this says.
Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker took a victory lap Sunday afternoon after the General Assembly wrapped up what was one of the busiest and most productive spring sessions in recent memory. Hello, I'm Jak Tichenor, and this is a special edition of Illinois Lawmakers as we take stock of this remarkable 6 months in the life of the General Assembly. I'm joined by John Jackson, visiting professor at SIU Carbondale's Paul Simon Public Policy Institute. We've watched these things come and go over the decades, Dr. Jackson, and I think both of us came away with the feeling that this is really one of the most productive and significant ones in a long time.
Absolutely. This was an extraordinary session. We've had sort of legislative gridlock, certainly for the last 4 years, and one could argue much longer than that. And all of a sudden the dam broke, all kinds of stuff got passed that people had talked about and wanted to do. You got bipartisanship on some of these bills, and you got really what could become a historic change in the way we finance Illinois government if this referendum were to pass.
And one of the things that struck me was the level of involvement on the key issues by the new governor, J.B. Pritzker. I'm reminded going back to, I believe, the late 1980s when you saw the same kind of thing with Governor Jim Thompson going out on the House floor and talking to individual lawmakers to try to get his White Sox Stadium bill passed. And of course, George Ryan was no slouch at that either, a former House Speaker. But this was remarkable.
Those two would come down off the second floor and they would get involved, even twisting arms, the Lyndon Johnson model in the Congress. And they got things done. They were legislator-friendly governors, and those were productive years for Illinois.
The supermajorities in the House and Senate for the Democratic Party, we had wondered how those would be utilized, and I think we saw some interesting things happen. The signature issue for the governor that you alluded to, the switching to a progressive income tax if voters approve it in 2020, was certainly, that was a must-have for the governor.
When the governor was elected, he had a huge majority. They had a supermajority in both the House and the Senate. And I think they took stock and said, Democrats have got to produce now. Monkey's on their back. And so I think they set out to do a number of things that they had promised, particularly the things you mentioned, and they just muscled it through without much Republican help. On the other hand, they got a good deal of, in fact, a remarkable lot of Republican help on 3 or 4 other very important things.
Well, we saw that in the $40 billion budget. Right. The last couple of budgets have been more or less bipartisan because they got through the mess with the 2.5-year budget impasse. The Republicans wanted that over with as well. But once the budget was in place, the next thing, of course, had to do with the Capitol bill and the gaming package, the sports betting that all went in. These were monstrously large, complex pieces of legislation to get across the finish line.
Well, they were. And the Capitol bill, we haven't had a Capitol bill since Pat Quinn's first year, 2010. So it's almost 10 years without a Capitol bill. We've had gaming around and proposals for casinos as long as you and I have been watching this stuff. Sports betting is a part of that, relatively new. But that stuff had been hanging fire forever, and all of a sudden, the logjam broke up.
What was interesting to me was in talking to folks in the last month of the legislative session, I saw, like on the Capitol bill, I was talking to Senator Sandoval on the Democratic side and Senator DeWitt, the Republican spokesman on the Transportation Committee. And they were basically reading from the same set of notes. And that was remarkable given some of the heavy lifts that were coming, let's say for the horizontal bill, and that had to do with raising the gas tax and licenses and fees.
Well, that's the way the legislative process has to work in a separation of powers system. It's the way in normal times it did work, but we haven't had normal times for a long time. It takes a certain amount of bipartisanship, and they got that on those bills that you're talking about.
And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in the next few minutes on Illinois Lawmakers. But first, what we're going to do is we're going to basically show you how the last 48 hours of the legislative session played out amidst all this drama. And then later, we're going to hear from two of the lawmakers who were kind of in the eye of the hurricane as all of these events unfolded at the state capitol. Lawmakers missed their May 31st adjournment deadline, but shuttle diplomacy between Governor Pritzker and the four legislative leaders paved the way for Saturday's overwhelmingly bipartisan House votes on a $40 billion budget for fiscal year 2020 and a $45 billion capital spending program.
There's a number of components that are in this: the implementation of a parking tax, expansion of the real estate transfer tax, institute of a floor and trade-in property tax exemption, increase in the cigarette tax, creation of leveling and playing field for the retail sales tax parity for the remote retailers, creates the Sports Wagering Act, and expands the Video Gaming Act, and expands land-based casinos and casino gambling in Illinois.
But anybody who's traveled our roads knows that we've been shortchanging that investment for years. Tonight we have a very difficult vote, but a necessary vote. Because if our infrastructure crumbles, our rural economy crumbles with it. Let's make that investment today. Let's put ourselves on a path to a future where those jobs continue, those investments continue, and those rural communities continue. Please join me in supporting this bill.
Have all voted to wish? Have all voted to wish? Mr. Clerk, please take the record.
We worked out this very difficult day, both sides of the aisle, both chambers, and the governor. We did the right thing. People, time after time, they will come and, look, we're easy to blame, we're low-hanging fruit for people to yell at, but people often say, and most of the time, will you guys just figure it out, work together, just get it done. I am proud to say that today we figured it out, we got it done.
In the end, people came together, recognized that there are differences in the General Assembly, but there are differences that can be reconciled. It's not easy. Sometimes it's pretty difficult. Sometimes it's painful. But if everybody comes to work with the goal of being reasonable and showing accomplishments, we have shown this session it can be done.
The Senate followed suit on Sunday.
Let those watching know that Senate Republicans came to the table. We didn't seek to turn it over. We weren't afraid to speak up when needed, and we weren't afraid to stand together when warranted. There is still a lot of work to do if we're going to move Illinois forward. Senate Republicans will continue to fight for middle-income residents, small businesses, and job creators to boost our economic development and create jobs.
I asked all of you to recognize why voters sent us here, and quite simply, they wanted us to get things done. And boy, have we risen to that challenge, right? 6 months later, as we prepare to adjourn for this spring session, we, and I mean all of us in this chamber, have produced an historic list of accomplishments designed to make Illinois better. Better wages, better schools, better roads, better opportunities. We have protected the rights and righted wrongs.
Governor Pritzker was flanked by senators from both parties during a post-session news conference.
Frankly, we all worked together on this. I mean, we did talk. My door was open to everyone standing behind me and everyone who's not standing behind me. And I had conversations with people from the moment that I took office, even before that, to this moment, across the aisle, in my own party. And the truth is that we changed legislation. We made sure that we were taking into account the views of people all across the spectrum. And, you know, sometimes I agreed, sometimes I disagreed, but we got a lot done, and I'm very proud of that fact.
Next on Illinois Lawmakers, we'll have a conversation with Senator Andy Manar, Democrat from Bunker Hill, in his district office. Thanks for making some time for us, Senator.
No problem.
I've been covering Springfield since the early 90s, and I can't remember a session where we've seen so many big issues get decided in a relatively short time. Is this the new normal with the Pritzker administration?
Well, I think first, just from my perspective, Jak, I started on the staff, the Senate staff, working for Vince DiMuzio in 1999. So I've been through my share of sessions over the years as a staffer and now as a member since 2013, a member of the Senate. So I would agree. We accomplished many, many things this year, and I think it goes back to Governor Pritzker's ambitious agenda that he put forward early on in the session. I would say even before the session began. But I think we will reflect on this session eventually as one of the most productive that the General Assembly and the governor have ever had.
To share some of the results from having supermajorities in both the House and the Senate. And the Democrats did flex their muscle on things like the graduated income tax, minimum wage hike, and reproductive health. But there was a lot of buy-in from Republicans on a number of the other big issues this year.
Yes, Capitol bill, for example, I said from the beginning that the only way that was going to get accomplished is if Republicans have a seat at the table. That was the case, and they had their hand in crafting that bill at the end of the day. The budget itself, think about where we were a year ago in the state with Governor Rauner and the divisive nature of budget making. That was nearly non-existent this year, and I credit the Pritzker administration for putting forward a truly balanced budget on day one, back on February the 20th, I think, when the governor convened the House and the Senate and put forward a truly no gimmick, balanced budget. That set the tone, I think, for bipartisan success.
There were some changes in the final document that did pass, but overall, the broad outlines were set from the get-go.
Yes, and I think that was, just having reflected now on, especially the last month of session, that's probably the most under-talked about story because there were so many things happening with major issues. But the strength of Governor Pritzker's budget proposal is evidenced by the fact that there weren't, in the large scheme of things, too many things changed by the legislature, and it garnered a significant number of Republicans that supported it.
What was interesting in talking with the House budgeteers, Greg Harris and Tom Demmer from their respective parties, I got the impression fairly early on there was general agreement on how much money there would be once we found out that we were getting some extra money from the federal tax changes back in April. There was general agreement fairly early on.
Yeah, I think there was, and my meeting with everyone that sits at a table and crafts the final agreement were very different than the previous 4 years. That helped. The April surprise, as we call it, helped. But I also want to mention that this time last year we took a very conservative revenue estimate to base the current year budget spending plan on. So that was a good move. And we are now 10 months into the fiscal year. Those revenue estimates that we based the current spending plan on were conservative in nature. That helped, again, pave the way for a bipartisan budget deal this year.
One of the big things that you were in on, of course, was Senator Sandoval and his Republican counterpart, Senator DeWitt, was from the Transportation Committee, had to do with actually developing the Capitol bill. The horizontal part of that with highways and bridges and roads and all was seemed to be fairly early agreement on the gas tax and some other things like that to get that part of it put together.
There was, and I think that speaks to the incredible need in the state. You don't have to go too far. You can go right outside here in my office and you can see a road that needs repair. But I think it speaks to the need. It also speaks to, again, the foundation that was laid by the Pritzker administration to reach out to business and labor and to all parts of the state to say, what can we do to bring folks together to get a robust capital plan, heavy on road and bridge repair and construction, so that we can turn this page finally. And I think the strength of that program, where we landed at the end of the day, and why it received bipartisan support, is because it's a sustainable plan. We will never be in the situation we're in today because of the action of Republicans and Democrats working together in the past week. We've had these ebbs and flows, these peaks and valleys of capital spending. We've crafted a program to make sure that that doesn't happen again. We will have a sustainable program from here on out.
And I want to speak to that. The fact that Terry Link and Senator Severson were able to pull the vertical part together with the gaming packages and sports betting and all of that, and of course with considerable assistance over in the House, is remarkable as well.
It is. And it was literally this, I don't like this saying, but it was literally the stars aligning toward the end of session in those 2 days of we call it overtime, but it was just past our adjournment date, our scheduled adjournment date. That really helped bring the conversation to a close, and it brought everyone to the table. It's not too often we get an issue as big and profound as capital to get Republicans and Democrats, business, labor, upstaters, downstaters, everybody together on the same page. And I think it's a credit to the governor, Governor Pritzker, for opening up his office, allowing people to come to the table and to share their ideas.
Senator Manar, thanks very much. We appreciate your time, as always, on Illinois Lawmakers.
Thank you.
And we can continue our conversation with State Representative Terri Bryant of Murphysboro. Representative, thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me today.
For Capitol watchers, this has been a very different kind of session, something much more productive, much more impactful in many ways.
It's been unique and different for me as well. So this is my 5th year there, and of course, the first 2 years that I was there, nothing really was done. We went through 2.5 years of a budget impasse. So this, certainly, I was afraid on Friday the 31st,
right,
that we were going to fall into the same thing again. And so it was nice to be able to land this plane.
The Democrats still held a supermajority, and they could very well have just pushed through all of Governor Pritzker's initiatives without any conversation even.
And they did in many cases. The abortion bill, certainly the progressive income tax, putting that on the ballot, and we saw the Fix the Floyd Act did receive enough votes in the House. We were, I believe, able to bring up enough really valid points about why it was bad legislation that we were able to kill it in the Senate. We're going to have some ongoing conversations about that through the summer. So there were some things that were kind of pushed through. But ultimately, when we came down to the Capitol bill, which I think we're going to talk about, they needed only 60 votes. The Republicans had committed to 20. But we saw 83, I think, on one of them and 87 on another. So obviously, it wasn't the minimum number of votes required. And I think we saw a real effort, upstate, downstate, east, west, Republican and Democrat, and all of our leaders and the governor.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that Governor Pritzker, the legislative leaders, are getting a lot of credit for a really bipartisan push to get all of this done, not just the Capitol bill, as you mentioned, but the overall state budget as well.
Well, we often see the Speaker. He will put his own budget together, and we know in the past, my predecessor, Mike Bost, very frustrated when you only had 20 minutes to look at it. I was a little frustrated that we were only going to have 12 hours to look at it. Our staff really did a fantastic job of breaking down the details as much as we could of the budget, but for 12 hours, I saw Leader Jim Durkin run back and forth between Speaker Madigan, President Cullerton, and the governor's office. And so Jim did a fantastic job of basically saying to Governor Pritzker, I know you want to put some Republican votes on this. We want it to be bipartisan. We want it to be from all over the state. But the Republicans are solidly together in saying, if we don't get the business reforms that we want, then we are not going to put votes on this. And clearly the Speaker, I think, would have been okay with that, but the governor was not okay with that. And so that was the leverage that we in a supermajority have not had before, and it was kind of exciting to watch.
So let's talk a little bit about those reforms. What is it that the GOP needed in order to put those votes, especially on the Capitol bill?
Sure. Well, I think we needed to be able to say to business that that we're not anti-business here in Illinois. So there were four different points that we wanted Three in particular I think we're going to talk about, but those were items that the business community has tried to get for at least 10 years. Certainly for the 4 years under Governor Rauner, they were things that Governor Rauner tried to get, but he just could not seem to get the deal cut. And so the Blue Collar Jobs Act, that is something for sure for 3 years we've tried to get, and that's really a proposal that is good for business, but it's also good for labor. And so we're going to be able to bring a lot of construction jobs into Illinois, not just because of the capital bill, either vertical or horizontal, but also because of the Blue Collar Jobs Act. So businesses that come in and build businesses here, and they're gonna get a little bit of a perk for doing that. And then of course I think the big one really besides that was ending the franchise fee. I was told that is probably a $50 million per year perk to small businesses here in Illinois. So certainly that's a big deal.
A couple of big incentives in just about a minute or so that we have remaining. This capital bill is a big deal, and partially because it's not just a one-off. The funding for this is going to continue even beyond the proposals included.
It is, and so think about as far as the vertical goes, as much as some folks didn't want gambling, we're going to have long-term revenue here for continued capital for vertical. But on the horizontal, we had not raised the motor fuel tax for many, many years, I believe back to the 70s. And so even though it's a hard pill to swallow, we have to remember that we're continuing to ask that our vehicles get better and better gas mileage. Certainly we have electric cars and we want to pursue that, but that's how we fund our roads. The other component of that is we're going to be moving, starting in 2022, what we've been paying for the sales tax is going to also move over into the lockbox. So we're going to have sustained funding, it's going to be safe in the lockbox, and we're going to have thousands of jobs here in Illinois. I hope that in the future that the biggest complaint we have is that we have traffic caused by all of the road and bridge construction that we're doing here in Illinois.
State Representative Terri Bryant, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks for having me today.
Back with Dr. John Jackson on Illinois lawmakers. You know, one of the things Representative Bryant just talked about there was the Republican support was wavering on Friday of the actual the May 31st, the last day. They were not convinced that there was enough in the way of business reforms in there. And there was some shuttle diplomacy back and forth between Leader Durkin, the Governor Pritzker, and of course the other legislative leaders.
The governor got heavily involved in that, and he gave away some things that probably the Democratic caucus would not have wanted to give away, but he wanted to get that done, and he bargained and compromised, and the outcome was not only did they get the vote, but Minority Leader Jim Durkin came out the next day in front of the cameras and said, this is a bipartisan approach. We got things done that Republicans have wanted for the last 4 years. And I'm proud to say we had a heavy hand in this.
And I think it's interesting that for a lot of folks who aren't familiar with Governor Pritzker's background, he was often referred to as the mayor of the Chicago Loop. When you wanted to get something major in terms of a big project done down there, Pritzker was one of the people who would get the stakeholders together and figure out what everybody wanted and what they could live with.
I think he had that reputation in Chicago, but it's a much bigger arena in some ways, and he showed that those skills are transferable, and I think it's a part of his personality. He doesn't get all ego-driven about these things. He just takes it as a job and as a mission, and in this case, got it done.
As we look forward, so much got accomplished in 6 months. If past is prologue, what does this spell for the rest of the governor's term?
Well, I think this style will continue to be his style, and there could be a backlash. We'll have to wait and see. But I think he will focus mostly on the referendum that's coming up, trying to convince people that we've really turned a corner. And he's got to convince a lot of audiences, including the New York rating and bond house agencies. And if they can see that we have a viable fiscal plan, that the revenue is there, things are going to start looking up on the credit front.
There were some early signs that at least what happened in this session did please some of the folks on Wall Street as far as the credit outlook goes. And it was interesting as the budget itself took place. I talked to a lot of the so-called budgeteers who were in the working groups, and they were generally in agreement several weeks back that they could finish this thing up. The revenue estimates they were using were fairly conservative. They knew they could do it. And of course, it didn't hurt that $1.5 billion of new money was found in April they weren't counting on.
Well, those highway bonds and all of those construction bonds have got to be sold, they've got to be financed, but there's a stream of revenue, and that revenue, of course, is coming from the motor fuel tax and from the license tax. Now, people are going to be upset, they're going to complain about that, but if you want roads and bridges, and if you want deferred maintenance at universities and a long list of things that have got to be done, then somebody's got to pay the bill.
Well, and one of the things going back some years and talking to George Ryan many years ago, he said his capital bill that he ran in 1999 actually eased the economic activity that came from that, actually eased the situation with the dot-com bubble burst in 2000 and of course 9/11 the following year, and Illinois made it through those times a lot better.
We have always touted our central location in the United States as one of those great advantages for businesses, staying here and being located here. Of course, business people want to know that there's a plan, and they want to have uncertainty eliminated. And all of this helps to eliminate a lot of that uncertainty.
Dr. John Jackson, thanks so much for your time and your expertise on Illinois Lawmakers. We certainly appreciate that. That's it for this edition of Illinois Lawmakers. We'll be back with you in the fall veto session here on Illinois Public Television.